Welcome, everyone. My name is Betsy Ben. I'm the director of the Produce Safety Alliance, and we're certainly happy to have you with us this afternoon. Value everyone's time, and so we're hoping to make a really good use of this time while we're together. I am fortunate today to be joined by Donna Paul Clemens, who is our PSA coordinator and Northeast Extension Associate, and Don Steckel, who is our Special Projects PSA team member. And we've been very fortunate to have Don back with us for a short-term stint, helping us work on projects just like this. So as with all of our webinars, let me get to where I can advance this. There you go. You are all going to be muted. There will be time for questions and discussions at the end of this meeting, but you should also feel free to use the chat box, and we will try to answer the questions as we go. As you can see on this call, we also have a lot of the PSA team, so there's lots of folks to answer the messages in the chat box. This session will be recorded and shared via our listserv. I'm laughing because I said the word chat box, and I was on a parent meeting last night for a college my son is considering, and my husband kept saying, "That man sounds like a Muppet." So when I said chat box, I felt like a Muppet there for a moment. The views and opinions expressed in this presentation are those of the speakers and do not necessarily reflect legal advice, views, our positions of the PSA and its members, nor entities they represent. I will say that the slide and the material today is all internal PSA team stuff. And we have developed it based on our best understanding of what is currently going on from reading the literature, talking to colleagues in the FDA, and talking to our other SMEs or subject matter experts about these things. So that disclaimer goes, but I will say to the best of our abilities, we have tried to make sure all the information is correct with current understanding. So what are we going to talk about today? We're going to go over a little summary of regulatory requirements and timelines. We're going to talk to you about some efforts we've been working on. You're going to see fact sheets, required records, and a decision tree. Donna's going to go first. I'm going to go second. Don's going to go third. And then what we'd like to do is gather input on stakeholder needs from you. We do have time for discussion so that you all can say, "Oh, I'm already working on this," or "I think this is a need," to talk about how do we collaborate or how do we make this easier. The other thing that I think is really important to actually have a discussion about is how much concern is being expressed out there about the post-harvest part. Don't want to make a mountain out of a molehill. If there aren't a lot of questions, don't want to make it harder than it has to be. But if there are a lot of questions, then we want to be able to troubleshoot that. So that's really the goal. And starting out, we just want to go over, if my slide will advance, that is, there we go. Compliance dates. All right, so this should say FDA began enforcement. I should have edited, I thought I edited that on one version, but maybe it was a different presentation. Enforcement for harvest and post-harvest ag water requirements beginning in January of this year. So January 26, 2023 were for those businesses larger than $500,000, and it will come every year after until we get everybody into the compliance. We have been told by FDA and by states, most of those visits are going to be educational still. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that. But the compliance dates are here. And that's the most important thing to understand if growers are asking that question. These are the provisions in the FSMA produce safety rule that are currently part of the harvest and the post-harvest section that is in compliance. So we just wanted to share these right up front because as we move through today, you're going to see certain ones mentioned in some of these educational materials. So we wanted to make that very clear. When it comes to working with growers and packers, there is still some confusion, I think, about which parts of subpart E are we talking about, right? And so the ag water used during growing is not currently, and I appreciate Don added March 2023 here for context in case somebody's listening to this later, is currently not in compliance. right? This includes the microbial water quality profile sampling. It also includes E. coli standards. And what we want to make clear is that there's a new proposal out, and we're based on some FDA comments, we're expecting it might show up in October 2023 of this year. And that will be, we think, the final for production / pre-harvest water, right? But right now, those are not even in existence, and they're certainly not in compliance, in their compliance states. Okay, so that's a very important message. The other thing is that the requirements for harvest and post-harvest water are now enforceable during inspections, depending on your farm class size, right? So we're talking about those large farms right now, but every year in January, we're going to get another class, business size class, that comes into compliance. The key points here when we talk about harvest and post-harvest water are to make sure that the water does not have any detectable E. coli in a 100 ml sample at the start of operation. If they're using municipal water, they can get the test from the provider of the water. If they're using groundwater, they're going to have to test to make sure that it has no detectable generic E. coli. You cannot use surface water for harvest and post-harvest activities unless it is treated in a validated way that makes it free of detectable generic E. coli. So for these kind of things, I'm thinking about, we live near lakes here. There are people that use lake water, have a validated treatment, and they use that as their drinking water in their cabins, right? Some treatment that is in a validated way so that you know it has no detectable E. coli. The PSR also requires establishing a water change schedule and maintaining the quality. So you'll notice in the first bullet, we talk about no detectable E. coli at the start. You have to have a way to maintain that quality throughout. Sanitizers are not required. You should all remember this from 5.2 in the PSA training. But they're a really good idea as a way to maintain that quality, especially in recirculated or batch water. And they also have a benefit in single pass water as well. But single pass water is less of an issue because it's not recirculated or having a batch type thing where all the produce is together. All right. So when we talk about the goals for today, we mentioned this in the very beginning. We're going to go over some resources that we have in development. We're going to stop at the end of each of those to get your feedback and to see what you think. We also want to continually build collaboration. So we would love input of what is being developed by others so that people know where to spend time. If other people are working on the topic, maybe they don't want to work on it, and talk about opportunities for collaboration. And this really comes down to getting a sense from all of you what your stakeholders are saying about what their needs are. And this is the third bullet, is this thinking caps idea. What topics are confusing to growers and packers? And we internally had a pretty good discussion about, is there a lot of confusion? Sometimes I talk to trainers and they seem confused. Sometimes I talk to growers and they seem confused. But in the bigger picture, how widespread is that, right? And what other educational materials can we work on? Because we're hoping to finish these up, get them out, let people use them, and then move on to new things. And let me just say this out loud. With the rule coming October 23rd, we're already working on stuff for that with the assumption that what we've seen in the proposed rule will be likely what's in the final rule. So there is information out there. It's just we don't know what is actually final. Okay, so here's the products we're going to go over today. The first is a fact sheet called FSMA Produce Safety Rule. Agricultural Water System Inspection is different from an agricultural water assessment, or the AGWA, as everybody's calling it. And Donna's going to go over that one. Required records. This is the documentation requirements for water laboratory analysis results. And this is Don's probably favorite topic, is water sampling and water analysis. This makes him very happy. And the issue of confusion about what do I have to have on my record keeping. I think there's also a lot of confusion about what am I asking for how do I get a lab to give me the results I need? I can tell you from personal experience working with farmers have asked for the right analysis, but they get the wrong analysis, right? So how do you know that when you get your result that you actually didn't get what you asked for? And it's a very interesting topic. And again, Don really led the movement on this, but I'm going to cover that one today. And then Don's going to talk about the agricultural water system inspection template that's paired with a decision tree for conducting and documenting agricultural water systems inspection. This was 2 documents. That is now, I think, 1 document after a lot of, no, it's still 2 documents. Oh, that's right. That was the other one we put together. We've been editing these a lot. They're still going to see a few edits, but he's going to talk about that one today. So with that, Donna, you're up next, and I am happy to keep slide sharing if you want to do that, and just tell me to.
Thank you, Betsy. And before we jump into this, there were 2 questions that I wanted to make sure we addressed before we move on. The first one is in the Q&A box, and Betsy, I guess I'll serve this one to you. Asking about what about springs? So you mentioned that for post-harvest water, there is the requirement that untreated surface water not be used for that purpose. So the question asks, what about using springs with treatment? Is that considered groundwater? How do springs fall?
Okay, so if you'll remember from, again, from module 5.1, how do we determine if spring water is groundwater or surface water? And the answer is it under the influence of surface water? So in a case where the spring water comes out of the ground and is caught in a, I don't want to say in a sterile way, but in a way that captures the water where the water is not under the influence of surface water, that would be a groundwater source. If it is running across the surface water or running across the land and then captured, it would, of course, be a surface water source because it's under the influence of an open environment. And Don has his hand up, so I'm not going to deny him popping in here to say something about this.
I appreciate that. And I think that we can simplify it even more by saying that if the water is treated, it becomes treated water. Not groundwater, it becomes treated water, regardless of whether it was groundwater or surface water when it started. And if it is no detectable generic E. coli and safe and adequate sanitary quality for that use, treated water can be used as pre-harvest, I'm sorry, post-harvest / harvest or post-harvest water. Would you agree with that assessment?
What is interesting is how you read that question versus how I read that question.
I thought it was interesting too. You're not converting something to groundwater. It actually becomes treated water if it's treated.
Yes. And then I think it becomes the issue of how are you treating it? So let's be clear that treating it is not just throwing in a bunch of sanitizer and hoping that you get something that has no detectable generic E. coli, right? So let's be clear about that. But in terms of a spring, if you're trying to determine if a spring is a groundwater or surface water source, it's how that water is captured and whether or not it's under the influence of surface water. To Don's point, focusing on that issue of treatment, it then becomes a treated water source and has to have no detectable generic E. coli. But I want to stress that it has to be a validated, consistent type treatment. Anything else you want to add? Anyone else from the group? Okay, that was question number 1. I think you said there were 2, Donna, or just 1?
Yeah, so let's just go ahead and go to Karen verbally in case anybody's just on the phone. Karen said, let's make sure that we know that in addition to actually treating the water, a record of the treatment is necessary. And the requirement is clear that you have to both monitor, keep records, and have some indication, scientific basis for believing that that treatment is effective to meet the goal.
Right. Much clearer way than me saying, don't just pour in sanitizer and hope for the best. Yes, absolutely. So thank you for that.
And Donna, I'll step in and address Mike's question, which is when are test results necessary for untreated groundwater used in post-harvest? And I'm going to ask this as a question to make sure that I understand correctly. In previous cycles, FDA has said the year of the educational visits, which is this year for large farms, is the year you have to start building your collection of data. And in the case of untreated groundwater used in harvest and post-harvest, the first year, well, during a year, there is a requirement to have 4 samples taken, written into the rule. there's a requirement to have 4 samples taken, all of which have no detectable generic E. coli. So if a farm that is using water in post-harvest doesn't currently have 4 samples from that groundwater source indicating no detectable E. coli, and they are a large farm, meaning that coverage that enforcement started this year, then this would be the year they need to have it. And presumably next year, and this is the questionable thing, next year when the inspector comes out to look at that large farm that was covered and inspected beginning 2023, they would expect to see those 4 no detect results from the 2023 season.
Correct.
Is that clear enough, and does everybody believe that?
Thank you for doing that. I could not see the chat box, so I spent this time trying to figure out where the chat box was. I appreciate that. If there's any other questions about that, please let us know, because this is a really important topic.
And Mike, if you could confirm in the chat, it looks like you did believe that answer was clear and answered your question.
And there is one more chat, but I'm not sure if this is better to save when we're talking about some of the record keeping requirements in the second document. But Valerie asked, our city has declined requests for letters for water quality, just a public website report that does not align with the standards I am familiar with. What records are needed for municipal water?
Wow, that's really interesting that they're telling them no on sharing their water test results.
And that is exactly one of the questions we have for the group. After we look at the model record for a lab analysis, is there a need for a model record for a municipal water source? And I just wanted to read the line from the rule that said, certificate of compliance that the water utility is meeting Safe Drinking Water Act requirements. So they don't specifically need the results. They need a certificate of, or a letter or certificate of conformance that they're meeting those requirements, but it has to be at least annually. So I think that leads to a very valid question. If you have this, many times utilities report with a 1-year or even a 2-year lag. Is we were in compliance in 2022 good enough during the 2023 season? I don't have that answer.
That is fantastic. That we need to put that on the list of things that we bring up with FDA and with others. Great question, Valerie, now that I can see my chat box. Yep, go ahead.
There's one more question that just came in. And I think I find that a lot of these questions, I think we've had similar discussions. So it's always great seeing people ask the same questions. I've had questions from growers if they have tested water in the past and completed a water profile in the past. So I'm assuming they mean a microbial water quality profile. Mm-hmm. Can they use that and then just test once now?
I'm assuming she's talking about a groundwater source, first of all. And I think the answer is yes. I don't think but in the past. So here's the question. Let's say they're in compliance this year, 2023. Let's say they did the 4 samples in 2022, and now they're doing 1 a year. Would an inspector take that? I can't decide why they wouldn't, but I also can't answer the question. Donna?
I think it's fair to say that if they had 4 no detects from a previous year, that the inspector would not have a reason not to accept it. But I will say that
we're not inspectors.
We're not inspectors. And also there's the question of if you have 10 years running of no detects once a year. Our FDA speaker last month indicated that they are looking down the road and thinking about whether or not that would substitute for 4 no detects in 1 year. But as you said, it's not our place to say.
And I think I have heard FDA say fairly recently that there was not a solid answer on this yet. And I think Wes concurs.
And you have 2 votes from Wes and Tucker in the chat box saying the same thing. All right, so good question, and thanks Wes and Tucker for weighing in on that, because that's helpful to know that we're all on the same page and that we don't know the answer. Okay, fantastic.
So with that, I'm going to jump in. I am going to talk about the first document that we wanted to sort of preview for you all, and then ask for input on this topic. So this one is a fact sheet that was developed, sort of summarizing the differences between an agricultural water systems inspection, which is currently enforceable in 112.42, and then the proposed agricultural water assessment that is proposed in the new subpart E for primarily water or production water requirements. So the approach that we took here is a multi-page fact sheet. So we have done our best to whittle it down to 2 pages front and back. And the reason this fact sheet came about is that we were receiving a lot of questions, and I know a lot of other folks in conversations were receiving questions and just experienced confusion about the differences between that agricultural water system inspection and then the proposed agricultural water assessment. And I think, and I will say, I was also a little confused. I did not realize until the proposed requirements came out that the agricultural water system inspection is applicable to both production water and harvest and post-harvest water. If you're familiar with the PSA grower training manual, we really only talk about the inspection currently in module 5.1, but this requirement really kind of covers all of those water systems, both production water and harvest, post-harvest water. So the audience and usage really for this fact sheet, we expect it's going to be helpful for really anybody, growers, packers, PSA trainers. I will say it is quite detailed. So I personally am going to find this very helpful when I start to present the agricultural water modules, or when I present them and get some of those very detailed questions about the requirements for each of those inspections and then the proposed ag water assessment. Next slide. So in the next few slides, we just wanted to sort of walk through the content of this fact sheet and sort of ask for your input at the very end. Is there anything that you think might be missing, or any input that you might have? So looking at this first page, this fact sheet really provides a narrative description of the agricultural water system inspection, and then how that is different from the proposed agricultural water assessment, or the AGWA, as a lot of us have been calling it, or AGWA. So this first page is, again, it's really a narrative description. We start with highlighting those differences. We give a lot of definitions. It would not be a PSA fact sheet if we didn't start off with a number of different definitions. And then if you go to the next slide. Next slide. So there you go. Thank you, Betsy. In the next slide, we sort of take a lot of that narrative description and we break it down into a chart. And I think this is probably my favorite part of the fact sheet, where we discuss the agricultural water system inspection on the left. And then on the right column is the proposed agricultural water assessment. So we really dig down into the nuts and bolts of really all components of those two inspections and assessments. So we look at the regulatory requirement and compliance date. As a reminder, the agricultural water system inspection is currently required for harvest and post-harvest water, whereas the ag water assessment we're looking at down the line because it is proposed, and that's really going to apply to pre-harvest or production water uses. We also look at the scope of requirement. The big difference between these two is that the ag water system inspection is really focusing on those ag water systems on covered farms to the extent under the farm's control. In contrast, the ag water assessment is really looking at any of those risks, not just under the farm's control. We also look at the frequency, how often is the inspection versus the assessment required, and then also those evaluation parameters. So we do have some abridged language from the produce safety rule, but what are those factors that are included for both the inspection and the assessment? And then next. And then we wrap up this chart with showing the outcome. So once the grower has walked through either the ag water system inspection or the proposed assessment, what is that grower supposed to do with the information? So either maintaining the water sources and distribution systems, or taking one of those corrective measures or mitigation measures proposed in the proposed subpart E. And then lastly, what are the record keeping requirements? Because it always comes down to record keeping. And then next slide. So then to wrap up this fact sheet on all of the nuts and bolts of an inspection versus the proposed ag water assessment, we have a discussion about compliance and enforcement dates. And then again, lastly, really what applies now. So if a grower was reading this, once they get through a few pages about all the details, okay, what do they have to do in this moment? And really highlighting that right now we're only worried about the agricultural water system inspection that applies to harvest and post-harvest water. Next. And then we also have a couple of resources, and then next. So now that I kind of showed you what this fact sheet looks like, we had a couple of questions as we were finalizing this document. The first thing we wanted to ask is the length okay? I know when I envisioned this fact sheet, I thought it was going to be like a one-pager. And then as we developed it, it turns out there's a lot of differences between the inspection and the assessment that I think once you compare side by side, having that detail is really important. So having tables for quick reference, but we wanted to ask you all for your input. Is something like this a two-page front and back? Is that okay? Is that too long? So I'll give you a moment to respond to that. Feel free to use the chat box. Perfect. Length is okay. More detail, the better. And thanks, Wes and Karen. That's kind of the approach that we opted to go to on a lot of these fact sheets, is I think as a trainer, having something like this to refer to is helpful. Okay, and then I'll ask the other two, feel free to add in the chat box. I will ask Don or Betsy to review it as I'm kind of looking at the screen here. But using a fact sheet like this, do you find that the differences between the ag water system inspection and water assessment are clear? And then we're always open to any additional content suggestions. Was there anything missing in our approach here, or are there any additions that you would recommend?
Is Priscilla able to unmute, Donna?
I think I can allow her. Give me one moment.
I thought Priscilla's just, she hasn't seen the other decision trees, so she may want to eat those words once she sees the last document.
She very clearly said small decision tree, and yeah.
just be careful what you ask for. Priscilla, you should be able to speak.
Okay. First of all, thank you for hosting this call. I think it's very important, given the confusion just around this topic in general. But as you know, this is my first time seeing this, and it was very brief. But I know one of the things, just because there's quite a bit of words, and for folks, maybe a small decision tree would be easy to visualize, because I didn't even realize that that folks currently have to have an ag water systems inspection, and this is something that I do frequently. So I think, if there's something, I'm trying to envision just a small decision tree. Okay, I'm a farm, so right now most farms believe that they don't have to do anything. So if there was just maybe some visual, I think would maybe capture things a little bit better, but that's just my initial thought.
So Priscilla, just to be clear, you're saying that a farm is saying, do I have to do any inspection? And if I have to do an inspection, do I also have to do an assessment? Is that
right?
Okay, thank you.
And I see there's a couple of comments Phil Tocco mentioned in the chat box. Can we take it longer to digest more fully? This is something I think we had a pretty lengthy conversation. We didn't want to waste people's time by really making you all read the document. So that was the approach that we took about sort of showcasing the broad topics. But absolutely, I think what I expect is we would publish this, and then any input is great, and we can always put out a newer version.
Yeah, what I will say is that internally within the team, we fight to get stuff out the door, and we've taken the stance of a V1. And then if people want something different, we'll do a V2 on it. But yeah, we're also happy to share it in a draft form. If somebody's like really desperate, I really want to read it, we'd share a draft and then get that out. I love Karen. Thank you for pointing out inconsistency in presentation of tables. So I'm going to go back and look at that because I think that's important. Yep. Okay. Left, right, flip. Yep. Great. Yep. Good point. I like to be consistent. So thank you for pointing that out. Okay. Is there anything in the content that's missing or additions? So we appreciate Priscilla's comment about, maybe something shorter. I know somebody else said for regulators, it's fine. It'd be nice if we could have something shorter for growers. Any other content suggestions? Okay, I don't want to, I think I counted to 10. Summary box for quick reference. Okay, thanks, Pam. Yeah, so yes, Don, that would be acceptable. So, okay. We're going to move on to, go ahead.
I was just passing it back to you.
Okay. Thanks, Donna, for that. Required records, we're going to talk about the results of water testing. I mentioned this at the beginning, but the issue here is 11250B2 has a record of analysis and results required to be obtained and kept by the farm. So this is a motivation, it's a requirement. The approach was to give an example of what might come back from a lab and to try and highlight what is actually required. And explain other useful content that may be there. I think one of the nicest things about what you're going to see is right now we're trying to use some color coding to do that for people, but also to make farms aware that if the lab doesn't provide the information, they still have to have the information, right? So how do they make additions to the record to capture the information that they need? And I think that's really important. So we think in terms of audience and usage that it will be personnel from covered farms predominantly, again, as a requirement for the PSR, will use the information to evaluate whether the water analysis they have is compliant or not, and to be able to add that necessary information. But any grower or packer that is testing, I think this will be really valuable, again, because I think what happens is they ask for what they think is the right test. The results they get are not always what they expect they're going to get. So I think it's really valuable from that point. Again, we're going to do what we did with Donna. We're going to walk through this rather quickly. So I'm going to apologize for those of you who are like, wait, I want to read the whole thing. The big thing I want to talk about on this particular page is this comes down to a length thing again. This thing is sitting at about 5 pages, and we would love to get it down to a front and a back. One of the things we've been discussing is this expert tip, how our fecal indicator bacteria are related. If we get rid of this here box, we can fit it on 2 pages front and back. And so I was actually going to cut it in the editing session, and we decided we would just highlight it for all of you so that you knew. To me, this probably could be its own 1-pager fact sheet. We know people have a little confusion, so we wouldn't necessarily jettison the information, but we might turn it into its own 1-page fact sheet, which will probably turn into a front and back because we can't help ourselves. But but I think that's one of the topics we're talking about as well. And again, it does walk through talking about what are the requirements for ag water, and all of that. So that's this first page. And then talking about what's required of growers and packers submitting water samples to laboratories. One of the interesting things here, again, labs aren't covered by the PSR, right? So what they provide may not align with what is required by the PSR, and I think that's important to note. And different highlights here, the National GAPS program has a standard operating procedure for sampling, but helping the growers understand what is typical of water sampling. And again, I think a good job here talking about method 1603, which you'll remember was the initial one that was allowed before they expanded it to additional methodologies and some of those things that are typically found in protocols, right? So that growers understand. as long as it's sampling information. What documentation do they need to supply? Again, you can see here the laboratories aren't covered by the PSR. So really making sure the growers know what they have to do. Growers do not have to use accredited labs. They may choose to use an accredited lab so that they have more faith in the results, but they're not required to do that. To me, this issue of not having to use an accredited lab may be one of the most valuable parts for our growers that are located in very rural areas where there are no labs available, because an extension office or other group could set up a lab to provide some of these water samples that they need. And I think that's a really important consideration that we don't really talk about in this, but I do want to mention it while we're on the topic. This is probably the pièce de résistance in this document, in the sense of you can see here in red what is required. And this is the information where we're trying to really help the growers understand what they need, what kind of information needs to be documented. All right. And then the last page is really references. We had a very long discussion yesterday about whether or not to include this information, which was captured in a different fact sheet we did. But Donna, I think, was the one who came out very strongly about this being very valuable in the past and important, because sometimes what the lab reports, the way they report it, it isn't clear what you're actually looking at, right? So this table helps clarify, yes, I'm meeting expectations. This is what this actually is. Okay, so we did decide to keep this even though it's pulled from a different fact sheet.
And Betsy, I'm going to take a moment. There was a great question in the chat or in the Q&A that I think is relevant here. So the question is, do growers need to know or explain which test was used to get the results? Our lab's results don't show that in Virginia.
Can you page back to the model there?
Yeah, I can page back, but I'm a little confused. Are you asking if the growers have to indicate what method was used?
And I'm going to unmute Stacia unless she wants to use the chat box. So give me 1 second.
So in this, I just wanted to point out one thing, that the red boxes, or I'm sorry, the red requirements are paired with a box underneath that gives the actual provision number. And I wondered if that was clear to everyone. And you
Right here.
Yeah. Thank you, Betsy. That's funny. I was circling them myself as if people could see them.
Yeah, I was not sure you could see my little cursor moving, but yeah.
That way people can look and see exactly, for instance, method used by the lab is in red, and it references number 3, which is those charts on the next page, and 11251 is where it says that that you can only use this type of method. So so there's that.
Right, which is, I think, the question she was asking, but go ahead. Say.
Oh, this is Stacia. I was asking, since the tests don't show the method used, the grower needs to call the lab. Like, I've tried to call the labs to ask what methods are mostly used, and I don't really get through. So I was curious who's responsible. And is there any way we can get the state to start including that? Thank you.
Well, boy, that's a lot of questions right there. So let's start with the first one. The growers are responsible for having the information in the document. So growers are responsible. If the lab does not provide it, the growers are responsible for getting it. And if they're going to edit a lab sheet, they need to write it in and then, of course, initial it and put that they made the change. But so that's part number 1. The lab should, upon a phone call, be able to tell them the analysis was done. If they can't, don't ever use that lab again. And then 3, the question about how do we get labs to do it? That's a little bit different. And I do want to mention, Don has been trying to work with a lab. I forget the name of the organization, Don, so you're going to have to forgive me.
The APHL?
Yeah.
Association of Public Health Laboratories?
Right. He has done some work with them trying to explain to them what growers are asking for when they call. And Don, I don't know if you want to elaborate on the work you've done with them, but those are ways I think we can get to influence the labs to start trying to provide the information. I also think in some of the labs I've worked with, once this is out, supplying this to the lab and saying this is what the growers need might be very helpful. Does that help, Stacey?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay. Don, did you want to add anything? Okay. So moving back.
And I just want to address that there have been some really good suggestions in the chat box. So even if we don't verbally mention, I know Karen had suggested maybe using that expert tip box as a visual instead of writing. And she suggested an example. So thank you.
All right. So again, we're looking at the length here as a concern because the mantra in the PSA team is people don't like to read, I guess. So we're trying to keep things short and to the point. Many of you have suggested like shortcuts, which are really tough to do because you feel like information needs to be included. That box for coliforms, fecal coliforms, and E. coli, if people have an opinion about that, you can let us know. Any question or confusion about what you saw? I'll pause. Okay, Jessica's supporting that. Those boxes saying. Ooh. And Elisa suggests a mock script. Okay.
It's a great idea.
Mm-hmm.
And we do have one of those in the can for the GAPS course.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Another fact sheet. Instead of a spreadsheet, we'll make a fact sheet for that.
Job security for Don Steckles. Thank you.
Okay, Sean is saying wider audience and more words. You need to explain it to everyone. Okay, thank you everyone for that. You ready, Don? I'm gonna cue you up.
I'm as ready as I'm going to be.
All right.
Okay, so the ag water system inspection, as Donna, many people have been surprised as we actually think about the reality of compliance and we look at those words that we had previously looked at and said, yeah, I can tell growers what to do in front of a classroom. As we thought about the realities of them, the rabbit hole kept getting deeper and deeper and more complex. So you may know that there is a required record template for an agricultural water system inspection, which is useful, but it doesn't go all the way to describe all of the parts of the activity that is described in the rule. And I will say that pending guidance and pending inspectional precedent, we don't know exactly what the inspectors are going to be looking for. So we're doing our best, and is my habit, if not the entire PSA habit, it is generally we try to give your money's worth, and we try to give you everything you might need because we can always trim it down. So our motivation was to describe the required activity and the required record, address all the expectations in 11242, including the ones that as we went down the rabbit hole, we said, oh, I hadn't really thought that that was actually something we needed to consider. Since we now have the proposed revision to some parts of subpart E having to do with production water, and the preamble to that makes clear that in current thinking, the inspectional process would involve, and this goes back to Priscilla's decision tree, if you're using groundwater for instance, you would be expected to do an agricultural water system inspection and then do a agricultural water assessment. And I'm sorry, I didn't mean to focus on groundwater. I meant to say focused on production water. when the requirements come into play for production water, the expectation is that a farm would do an ag water system inspection and then follow it up with an agricultural water assessment. Therefore, since it's a two-part process, we felt that it was very important that, to the best of our knowledge, the system we use for the ag water inspection is compatible with the AGWA as it's proposed. So we updated the required record. We created step-by-step usage instructions 5 times, I think, by my count. And we're hoping this last time sticks, or at least is a step in the right direction, because step instructions, as you'll see, can get very complicated if you try to be thorough and comprehensive and universal. We want growers and packers to be able to use this product directly to fulfill the requirements of 42, which is the inspectional process, ag water system inspection process, and also the required record. Keep going. So this is the beginning of the flow charts. The first question, we started with the decision tree from the National GAPS program, because this has been a really positive and useful foundation for a lot of the work that we do in meeting produce safety rule requirements, because they're based on good, solid GAPS principles. Having a water source map is a good idea, not a requirement of the rule. So what I want to point out to you is question 1 is, do you have a water source and system map? And there's a box on the right-hand side at the top in dots that says a map is useful, but it's not required by produce safety rules. So you'll see this tendency that we'll have a question and the answer is going to come up. You know, it'll be a yes, no question, and then there'll be a dotted box that gives an explanation. And this is an overview decision tree. This is an overview graphic of the system, but it gets more detailed in later steps, which you're about to see. So part A is the part, go back to, again, please, Donna or Betsy. Part A is the part that we had previously not captured in our documentation, that FDA explicitly says in 112.42 that the decisions have to be made, have to consider question 2, the nature of the water source, question 3, the extent of your control, question 4, the degree of protection, and so on, before you get, so we went through that to describe the system before you even get to part B, which is what we normally think of the inspection, which is, are there a lot of geese in the pond and things like that. So now go forward, please. So part B, what are the current conditions? And then this is not explicit in 112.42. 112.42 simply says you must maintain as necessary in B1, 2, and 3. But the general outcomes for within the bigger context of the rule are, well, if it's not safe and of adequate sanitary quality, you have to do something about it. If it may allow pathogens into the water, what are you going to do about it? And that's making the decision to do some maintenance. And if you say, yep, still doing a great job, we're good, well, then continue use of the water and go on. So that's in the big picture, there's a part A, a part B, and some decisions are made. It's not just a check the box, yes, I did an inspection. Go on. So, and this is going to be a timing thing, Betsy, because this is all animated. Using a decision tree to fill records part A, each question, you remember there were questions 2 through 5, has a decision tree. And the question we had in the Q&A box is a great example of something as simple as what's the nature of the water source. We made these decision trees to be unambiguous and to take away uncertainty so that people can have confidence in what they write into the record. So go ahead and hit enter once. So we're going to do an example of a reservoir that is filled with a well, because that comes up pretty often. And that's one of the, it's not terribly confusing, but it's a little confusing. What is the water that's in a reservoir that's filled by the well? What's the nature of that water source? Go on. Don't be intimidated by this decision tree, please. If you've ever used a taxonomic key, it's a lot like a taxonomic key. So you're just following things step by step. Hit enter once. So 2.1, is the water source a public water supply or a public water system? We expect that a farmer may not know the significance of those words. So we put a note, if you can hover on that note on the right-hand side. Note 1, this is what a public water system is. This is what a public water supply is. This helps you know whether the answer to this question is yes or no. So based on this question, the answer is actually no. So go to the next one. Well, once it comes up, yeah, is the water treated before use? So this comes to, I think, that same question. If the water is treated, it becomes treated water. It goes over to A. But in this case, or it goes over to the right. But in this case, the water is not treated. So is it a reservoir, or is any part of the water system open to the atmosphere? The answer in this case is yes. So go to the right. So you're going to enter surface water in part A of this document. So continue down. So that's generally how the decision tree is used. This is what the actual record looks like. There's part A, we've already put in the name and address of the farm, the date of the inspection. I couldn't resist putting it April Fool's Day. And then who did the inspection. So in this case, we have basically two sources. We have a well and we have a pond. The example we took through was the pond that is filled by well, I'm sorry, it's a reservoir that's filled by well one. It's a pond that's filled by well one. So can continue once. So the well continues to be groundwater as long as it meets the definition of groundwater. But the pond that's filled by well one is surface water, and we got to that surface water result based on going through the decision tree like we had just done. There are other decision trees for question 3, question 4, and question 5, and question 6. Go ahead and hit it once. And so you can fill in, and we give examples of we give examples of language that a farm might use, saying full control, partial control, no control, saying full protection, partial protection, no protection, and saying there's no potential concerns or what the potential concerns are, and so on. So the decision tree, and we obviously don't have time to go through the entire thing, but the decision tree helps a grower have confidence that they're putting in something that's sensible, and it gives them a lot of notes so they can defend what their choice was, so they can describe and explain what that choice was. If the inspector says, did you consider the nature of the source, the extent of control, and the other 4 things that are in that list? Hit down. Then we get to part B, which is more, could the observed conditions allow, in the context of those considerations, allow pathogens to be introduced into the water source distribution system, et cetera, et cetera. If the answer is yes, well, then you're going through the small decision tree that I showed at the beginning. Is it still safe and of adequate sanitary quality? Is there maintenance needed to stop that from happening? Go down. And then the farm would fill it out. So in this case, we're just focused on the well, that well one, during the annual inspection, they looked and they said that runoff is directed away from the wellhead. The pad is intact. The backflow protection device is functional. We didn't need to take any corrective measures or other actions initial. And then a month later, they did a follow-up look. And they said, man, when I turn on the pump, that vacuum breaker is not burping. My backflow protection device isn't working anymore. So I replaced the vacuum breaker. And so that's how we envisioned that a farm would use this. So given that very brief overview of a somewhat complicated system, let's get some feedback and ask. It's complicated. And I heard somebody say the other day something that I very much appreciated, when somebody said, can't you simplify it? And that person said, if you oversimplify a complicated system, you give the impression that it's simple, and it's not simple. So I will ask you to keep that in mind as you ask for something simpler. If there's a simpler way, we would absolutely do it, and we'd love to do it a simpler way.
Well, and I will say internally within the team, it's not like we all don't understand that, right? And I think what drove us towards the direction of this decision tree, and let me just say, I think Don said 5 versions. I'm not sure if it's 5, but it's been through a lot of versions to get to this point, because we've already taken a swat at trying to beat the complexity out of it as much as we can. So I think the key thing is, the functionality of it. Like, does this look like a functional approach? right? Is it clear? I mean, I think there are very clear yes, no, making it clear, the dotted boxes to provide information. Somebody I know in the chat box mentioned, try and give them guidance as to what that chat box is or what that dotted line box is referencing, right? So there might be tweaks we can do there. But we'll give you a few moments to put stuff in the chat box or the Q&A.
Thank you, Emily. The idea was, once you get over the visual challenges, and I hope Mike or Rob can help us get over the visual, that we're trying to make this manageable. Right now, it does look a little bit like spaghetti.
I will say the other thing we've talked about before finalizing it is having actually grower focus groups to make sure it's workable. When we did I should look to see who's on this call with us, but when we did the original gaps decision trees, we did focus group those a lot and learned a lot through that process. I was looking to see if Annette was on the call.
I did not notice her name.
Yeah, I didn't see her, or Michelle, but
So Karen wants clarification on the format. And as I'm envisioning it, the required record is going to go into the required records document, just like every other required record that a farm is required to fill out themselves, but that it would link to the decision tree, which would be a standalone fact sheet to give them guidance on how. One way, hopefully, one correct way to fill out this thing that will meet regulatory requirements.
and I actually think in the fact sheet, we would probably include the records so that they're clear what they are, but the records would then appear in our required records document. And again, as Don pointed out at the beginning, I just want to say this again, there's currently a required record document for this already in that document. It's just that after we thought more about it, after we realized they were going to bring in the implementation of harvest and post-harvest before pre-harvest and production, we really, I just remember the call with Don where we went step by step in the very beginning. What is in there? How are we going to tackle this? We just decided that was the best way to do it, was to go section by section, so we didn't miss anything. And I also will say, we maybe have over-engineered this. And Don mentioned it at the beginning. Without real inspectional feedback, we don't really know what to expect. What we did was follow what's in the rule. What does it say in the rule is required, and make sure all of that is captured.
Right.
I just want to say that again, because there is some possibility we over-engineered it.
Yeah, we wanted to be confident that it would be acceptable during an inspectional process.
Mm-hmm.
And part B is essentially the same thing as the existing required record. It's the part A, the characteristics of the system that we had not previously included.
Mm-hmm. I think the other thing that is critically important to us, critically important to us. Yeah, we want the growers to be in compliance, but we want it to be valuable for assessing risks and helping them make the best decisions they can make. And that's the driving force behind it, right? We want to make sure everything's included, but how do we make that useful to them? And I think that's where Don has put in a lot of effort, with the sense of making sure they know what the words mean, making sure they know what they're actually choosing and the implications of choosing that. And that's been very important. Okay, so it is 3 o'clock, which makes me feel a little bit bad. So I'm going to move forward, and we do have just a few more slides, but this was really where we were hoping to get some group discussion. But I'm really happy we're here because you guys have been commenting a lot in the chat box. So if anybody wants to be unmuted to talk about stuff they're working on, we would welcome that. If somebody wants to jump in and say, hey, we're trying to get this done, or if there's other points of confusion that you think should be a priority, or other records that you would like us to work on, Those are all really important things we'd like to hear about.
And you can always put it in the chat box, or if you raise your hand, I can unmute you.
I love the grower group that's low tech. I'm curious what that means. I may have missed the earlier comment, sorry. Oh, Amish growers, okay.
Am I open here?
Yeah, you are, Mike.
Oh, I'm sorry. No,
Live.
I really like the decision tree, John. Sorry, just got sidetracked. I've done this thing like 4 times, and I like with the slides because you can really go through those. But what I've had to sort of do is fit it with folks in my class, or attendees, sort of fit their needs. But it gives you those broad categories. And I think you've done a nice job with those slides in terms of those basic risk assessment things you do. There's probably a little bit more work to do, but I think you guys are on the right track. It's going to be a little bit challenging. I know it's different things across the country, and I'm really appreciating that with the comments coming through, but no, job well done in my eye.
Thanks, Mike. Other thoughts?
And I just want to, Priscilla, you said this may be dependent on the proposed rule. This part is not dependent on the proposed rule. The proposed rule would just be production water, and we would anticipate going to a next step of doing a similar decision tree process to talk about things like characteristics of the plant and weather patterns and all the things that are necessary in the agwa.
And adjacent land use.
Yes.
Yes. No, this is real. This is required now.
Yeah, just to clarify that, I split my question or my thoughts into 2 different
Okay.
comments. So that thought was on the training or retraining
sorry about that.
specifically for the ag water requirements. I know that's going to be dependent whether it's mandatory to do based on the proposed, or would it be something that we do regardless, or provide that as a resource for folks that have already taken the PSR training?
So I can speak to what we think our plans are going to be on this end. You mean when the new subpart E for pre-harvest and harvest water, or pre-harvest and production water comes out?
Correct.
Okay, so here's the deal with that. As soon as it comes out, we are going to make update slides for 5.1 so that the growers can be informed of all of the changes. Here's what the final rule for production and pre-harvest water is. At the same time, and I don't think we can require that of growers unless FDA says it's required to give them an update. We will make it available to them in a lot of different platforms, in person, as a remote delivery, maybe even as a recorded thing. We haven't decided all of those, but we will make sure, and we will reach out to all 80,000 people that have taken this training and make sure they know it's available. So that's a huge thing. When it comes to trainers, we think we are going to require all trainers to take an update training. We're not going to make people take the PSA train the trainer again. We're not going to make them go through the lead trainer again, but we'll require them to take an update training because we suspect it's going to be so different that we're going to want them to know what's in that new module and how to train it. Again, probably on a bunch of different platforms, right? So that people have access to it. But the trainers, we're going to really feel very strongly that they're going to need to take that update training, and we'll make it like one of these things. We'll make it so that it is as short and to the point as it can be. We don't want to waste people's time, but we want to make sure they know what's in that module and be able to ask questions. That's the key thing. Does that make sense, Priscilla?
Yes, and you may have mentioned this before, but what's the timeline for these documents?
Wait, the ones you saw today?
Yes.
Yeah, so Don is hoping next week. Sorry, I shouldn't laugh. I'm usually the troublesome truck, so I'm making fun of myself. We have gotten really, really far on the editing, so I am hoping in the next week or 2 they'll all be out. Now they're going to chew on me for saying that out loud, but I'm really hoping.
The decision trees, that might be ambitious, but the other two,
Yeah.
I believe,
Yeah.
could easily go out
Mhm.
quickly.
Thank you, Don, for clarifying that. The decision tree is the ambitious one, because that one we really might try and test before we let it out the door. Other questions?
No questions. This is Priscilla again. I just want to say thank you. I think this is excellent work and very much needed, and I appreciate the work that the Produce Safety Alliance is doing on it.
I appreciate that. I also appreciate Emily's comment about us doing the Lord's work. Boy, if that were only the case. This brings us to the next question, though, and this one before you all run away, because I know we're starting to lose some numbers. The question is, and I think I know the answer from you all now, is we were talking about doing another educators call on post-harvest water to highlight some outreach efforts and new materials. We were talking about possibly doing an external speaker. We don't often do all PSA all the time. We took this time because we had new materials. But do you guys feel like we need more stuff on harvest and post-harvest water? That you can just give a yes or a no in the chat box would be really helpful, because again, we don't want to beat a dead horse. If you're all feeling like super confident, we'll move on to something else. Okay, we're getting a lot of yeses. That's what we needed to know.
It seems to
Thank
be
you.
clear.
Okay, that's just what we needed to know, because internally, I will say Don and I were like, horse dead? Keep beating the horse? What are we doing here?
We could go on for months this way.
Right. Right. So anyway, thank you. That's fantastic feedback. And if there's any other topics of interest, please put those in the chat box as well, so that we can get speakers and get lined up. And everybody on this team loves to have educators calls in the hopper of what we're going to do, so we're not panicking month to month. So if you have other topics you want to hear about or you want us to cover, let us know. And oh, sorry, but I really shouldn't have said that about the horse. I apologize for that turn of phrase. But yeah, and with that, here's the website. If you guys, the English and the Spanish version, so we welcome you to go there. I do want to point out that we are still having some redirect issues, and I am working on supporting Rob as he chases down IT to get those fixed. So if you happen to click a link and it takes you to Cal's homepage, just try it again, and eventually you'll get to the PSA, but we are working on it in case that has happened to you. And again, follow us on social media. Tori has been doing a great job of keeping us there. So with that, I'm going to ask Donna or Don if they have anything else they want to add.
I'll just say that, like everything, we always wonder whether what we do is relevant. So I really appreciate your input, your enthusiasm for letting us know that this is relevant and needed. It gives us the energy to continue on.
Yep. A couple of things I want to say. One, I really want to thank Don, has taken leadership because he's had bandwidth to do it. The other thing I want to say a shout out to is the entire PSA team, because everybody on the team has been hopping, providing edits to this stuff, doing their own jobs, trying to keep everything moving. So really, Donna and the entire PSA team, really good job on supporting all of these efforts. I know you saw the 3 heads today in the presentation, but I really do want to stress the input from the entire team and what that takes. And thank you all for your time. I know we are, I think about 9 minutes over or something, and I apologize for that. I like to keep it to an hour, but thank you very much for your time, feedback, thoughts, suggestions. We really value all of these. Thank you very much.
Thanks, everybody.